This program is brought to you by Emory University.
On January 21, 2015, the Office of the Provost at Emory University hosted a forum titled The Value of Public Scholarship. The panelists examined the impact of public scholarship on those who practice it and on their institutions. The speakers were Claire Stirk, Provost and Executive Vice President for Academic Affairs at Emory, Andra Gillespie, Associate Professor of Political Science at Emory, Carlos Marino, Associate Professor of Pathology and Laboratory Medicine at the Emory School of Medicine, and Megan McRaney, Assistant Director of Media Relations at Emory. In this video, Professor Gillespie describes the compelling reasons that motivate her to practice public scholarship.
When I was in graduate school and I was trying to come up with my grand scheme of how I was going to live, I would sometimes dream up what my obituary would look like in the New York Times. So I was hoping that my scholarship would be such that I could be like Bob Dahl or Philip Converse, who died in the past year, and have had their profiles featured in the Times. And so one of the things that I wanted people to say about me was that I was a teacher to everybody. So that didn't involve just being in the classroom. I always wanted my scholarship to be somehow relevant to the real world, and that I could speak to important public problems. That really does influence the types of questions that I ask, which sometimes puts me in conflict with colleagues in the discipline who would rather have something that was very esoteric or very, very technical, or something that only about 10 or 20 people actually really care about. And that's something that I'm committed to, even if it means that sometimes I don't necessarily have the profile or the acclaim of some of my colleagues. So I may not be able to walk around a conference and feel like I'm the big man because everybody is like bowing down to me. But I feel that my scholarship is relevant, and that more important, I'm asking questions that actually mean something to people. Part of this sort of comes from my experience. The year before I came to Emory, I worked in Washington, D.C. for a Democratic pollster, and oftentimes the struggle there was that I really wanted to ask the academic questions, and I didn't realize how many questions I still had until I actually took time off and actually worked in a real life setting. And I would often talk with the managing partner in my firm, who would be like, Andra, that's a really interesting question, but honestly it's not that relevant right now. And so I wanted to sometimes ask some of those relevant questions, hence I came back to the academy. But it gave me an insight into what questions are actually meaningful. And that's part of a larger discussion in political science. There are often some pundits, and I don't agree with everything that they say, but they say that political scientists are completely useless as public intellectuals. And it's not so much because we ask the wrong questions, it's just that we typically give the wrong answers. And so oftentimes there's this mistrust between political scientists and political practitioners and political observers who think that we have no idea what we're talking about, or that we're focusing on the wrong questions. To the extent that I can, I actually want to be sure that I'm asking the right questions and answering them in the right way, so that they're meaningful answers that can translate into layman's terms that can be explained to a wider audience. So that's part of the reason why. The other reason why I want to do public scholarship is that sometimes I hear commentary, or I hear people making overgeneralizations in the public square, and I get annoyed, and I really kind of want to correct people. And I know that I have the training and the background to be able to answer some of these questions, not all of them, but some of them. So let me turn to the win. I certainly faced the pressure. I remember in my first year review, somebody said, you need to remember to write real scholarship, and like, don't go write something in the Atlantic. And so I certainly felt that pressure to not do public scholarship while I was untenured. And Elaine Justice is sitting here. She can tell you my first semester here, I refused to do interviews because I was terrified. And in part of that was just sort of the normal fear of kind of being out there. But then I guess there was also that fear as well of going out too soon. Well, something interesting happened. Barack Obama ran for president, and I studied race. So I could have decided that I would wait until I got tenured to be out there, but I would have missed like 4 years. So I would have missed his candidacy, and I would have missed most of his first term in office. That just, from a timing standpoint, just did not make a whole lot of sense for me professionally if I wanted to be involved in these debates. So I felt this urgent need to kind of be current and be relevant with my research and be able to have an opportunity to put it out there. And it's been a wonderful and rewarding experience. If I had been asked questions of journalists and it turned turned them down, then I would have severed relationships that would have been very, very hard to build at this point. So I'm glad that I've had a chance to build those relationships with people. And there would have been a lot of people who maybe would have had the opportunity to say what I could have said, and I would have been left out of those conversations. And so I think that's important for me as a scholar, but also for me as a representative of Emory to be involved in those debates so that people understand that Emory is a place where we ask those types of questions. When I think about sort of the advice that I would give to people, I would tell somebody who is junior to be mindful of kind of how you present yourself and how often one presents themselves. But I'd like to put this into a little bit of perspective. Sometimes you're talking with a green reporter or a completely unprepared reporter who will demand like an hour of your time as you try to explain everything to them. And those are annoying and those are very time consuming. However, most of the time, journalists have a short amount of time, they have very tight deadlines, they want to talk to you for 10 or 15 minutes. Yeah, you might have to change your train of thought, but really you have 10 or 15 minutes here or there to be able to answer questions. So it really doesn't hurt for you to be able to answer those types of questions. If you have to go to a studio, there may be a little bit of time that's involved, but oftentimes people can come to you. So there's no reason for you not to be able to run downstairs from your office, do the camera shot, and then go back upstairs and go back to doing what it is that you were doing. And then also one of the important things to kind of keep in mind is that journalistic interest in what it is that you're doing, where your expertise usually kind of ebbs and flows with the news cycle. So it's not like you're really going to get asked stuff every day. So you can kind of plan around those types of things. So I know, because I'm a political scientist, because I'm interested in things like campaigns and elections, that it's going to get really crazy right around elections. So I can plan accordingly. So I know in my head I'm really not going to get a whole lot of writing done around, in the weeks leading up to an election. And I also know I'm probably going to have 2, 3, 4 interviews a day, and I can anticipate that. I can plan accordingly. But that's not every day. So I know that I can kind of plan this. I know that if there's a major event, stuff is likely going to happen at certain periods of time, so that I need to be prepared for that and that I can plan accordingly. But most of the time, I'm pretty much free to do my work and pretty much free to kind of live my life as I normally live it. So it's really not that much of an encroachment on my time. I also sort of have the benefit of having watched other public intellectuals and being friends with people who are really in that public intellectual space. So I've had the opportunity to watch how they've handled it, and I've had a chance to watch how they've done things well, and how some people, one person in particular, has done stuff that hasn't been that well, and it's actually been a really important lesson. And so I'm not going to give this person's name, but I remembered one time watching them on CNN 4 times in a 24-hour period. I like to keep the television on just for background noise, and so it's often on CNN. And so I just was like, wait a second. I saw you in the morning. I saw you on with Blitzer. I saw you on Anderson Cooper. I saw you in the overnight. Okay, that's overexposure. Like, that was way too much. And so this was something that came up when he went up for tenure, and he argued that, it was his public intellectual work that had given him a black mark. I went back and looked at his record. It was the self-published books with the provocative titles that prevented him from getting tenure. And so it's not the public scholarship. So I think oftentimes public scholarship can get scapegoated as the reason why some people aren't productive. That's rarely the case. So let me switch to talking about how I do public scholarship. So, there are a couple of rules. One, sometimes you have to think about overexposure, and that's really, really hard. I had that experience kind of with Ferguson and the BBC, because they kind of kept on calling. And sometimes I would bring stuff up, and oftentimes it was in the overnight hour anyway, so it wasn't like I was going to do anything. So I kind of just went, along with it in many instances. But there is something to be said for knowing when to say no. And so if you've got a schedule conflict, I had one last night during the State of the Union address. I was like, sorry, I can't help you out today. So it's comfortable to be able to say that. People will call back, especially if you are polite, respectful, and you have good relationships with those folks. The other thing about overexposure, sometimes this is my pet peeve, is when people start talking in issue areas where they really don't have a whole lot of expertise. So I come from a more interdisciplinary background, so I can actually talk about a lot of things, and many of my colleagues can talk about a lot of things. But there are times when I have been asked to talk about things that I really don't know anything about. Or I may know something about them, but I have a colleague who I know is much better suited to answer those types of questions. I think that it's actually the ethical thing to do to recommend the friend, as opposed to trying to answer questions that you don't know anything about. And sometimes my opinion of people who it seems like answer all kinds of questions is that they're really only interested in being on television or being quoted in the paper all the time. And so I tend to kind of have a sort of personal issue and have to try my best not to judge people in those types of circumstances. So I would say be generous sort of with your time, be generous in recommending other people if they would be better suited to answer questions. And then I think the thing that we think about, I think relates to some of Claire's comments about how one does public scholarship. There's a debate that came up. Bob Cohane, who is a dean in international politics, came to Emory last year to talk in the anthropology and environmental studies departments. And one of the things he mentioned about public scholarship, and he's much, much older, was that you shouldn't talk about your research in progress. You should only tell reporters stuff that's already been peer reviewed. And I kind of sat and listened to that going, yeah, I don't agree with that. Thinking that that it's only valuable if it's gone through the peer review process. And I understood where he was coming from in terms of talking about making sure that things get vetted. And so I think that that's something to think about. So if you know your idea is kind of half-baked, then this may not be the place to sort of disseminate it. But public scholarship, especially editorial writing, might be a place where you can start to work out ideas. And especially if you're helping to develop theory, this could be as valuable because you have to do it in 800 words or less in a way that you're not going to necessarily be able to do in a conference paper, which is the other place where we usually try to test our ideas out. So I think that there's actually a way that this can actually help inform our scholarship. The other thing that I really like about public scholarship is that sometimes reporters ask empirical questions, and I might not be able to answer the question, but it might give you a good idea for a project that you can do later on. And so it's always helpful to have that interface with people to get you thinking about your research in ways that's actually really important. In many departments, you have one or two people who tend to focus on similar types of questions, and you might be able to form a bond with them. But oftentimes, it's nice to have a critical mass of people who are thinking about the same types of questions. And oftentimes, the journalists are thinking about it from a different perspective, and they'll sort of give you here's how you mass market this in order to disseminate it to a wider audience. So I think it's important to think about that. I think about the challenges that come along with this. Oftentimes people ask questions that I would love to run a survey experiment with on Mechanical Turk. And because I work for an institution, I have to think about IRB. And that's a pain, which means that 3 weeks from now, when IRB finally approves this study that I can put up really quickly and really inexpensively, nobody cares about the subject matter anymore. So I think we have to think about how nimble we can be in terms of being able to test questions, even if and when we have the capacity to be able to test those questions instantly here. Because oftentimes we can't predict when the next terrorist attack is going to come, or when the next verdict that's going to be unpopular is going to happen, or even when the president makes a smart mouth comment in the State of the Union address, and you kind of want to know empirically, well, what was going on there? That's not going to be something that's going to be relevant a month from now. So it would be really nice to be able to test it today and then be able to talk about it tomorrow. So those are all things that are going to be pretty limited. But on the whole, I actually think that I've really enjoyed the public scholarship side of my work. It's something that I appreciate and something that I'm thankful that there are people here who support me in doing that.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.